Well, welcome to the program, everyone. On the day a hospital in Syria became a place where people had no choice but to die. In the city of Aleppo, airstrikes on rebel-held areas destroyed a hospital where Doctors Without Borders had been treating patients. We know tonight at least 14 doctors, nurses, and the sick perished. A total of 60 people have died in attacks since yesterday. Now, the situation on the ground has gone from bad to worse at lightning speed this week. The chief UN envoy to Syria putting it in stark terms. On average, an average of one Syrian is killed every 25 minutes. Now, that means by the end of this program, 2 people in Syria could very well become victims in what they still call a ceasefire. The UN sent out an appeal today to Russia and the U.S. to intervene again, just as they did before the ceasefire went into effect back in February. Well, so far, Washington says the attacks appear deliberate, and it's pointing the finger at Moscow to rein in Syrian President Assad and his military. Russia, which is providing airstrikes and air cover for Assad's troops, saying tonight that it had nothing to do with the attacks in Aleppo. And that is where our coverage begins.
Where do you take shelter when nowhere is safe? Bombs in Syria's biggest city, Aleppo, have again sent people fleeing from their homes. Amid a few glimmers of hope, the overall picture is one of desperation. The feelings of countless people are echoed in the words of one little girl. What wrong have we done, she asks, and where to go for help. On Wednesday, bombs fell on this hospital run by Doctors Without Borders, killing dozens, including, activists say, the city's last pediatrician. The Syrian regime denies it targeted the hospital. The ceasefire agreement in February gave some hope that there could be a way out of this conflict. But only 2 months on, peace talks have stalled, and the shaky ceasefire deal is in danger of unraveling.
I could not in any way express how high the stakes are for the next hours and days. So many civilian lives are at stake. So many humanitarian health workers and relief workers are being bombed, killed, maimed at the moment, that the whole lifeline to millions of people is now also at stake.
Aleppo plays a key role. Controlled partly by the government and partly by rebels, it's been the scene of bitter fighting for years. In recent days, rebels have ramped up their attacks on the government here to try to preserve their last supply route. Meanwhile, reports say the regime is planning another massive operation against them.
Well, we want to go now to journalist Louisa Lovelock. She's following developments in Syria. She is in Istanbul at the moment. Good evening to you, Louisa. We know it is extremely difficult to get and verify information from Aleppo. For our viewers, tell us how you're able to collect the facts that comprise this tragic turn in Syria.
Well, it's not easy without eyes and ears on the ground, but there are ways. I have my own network of sources. I communicate on a daily basis using WhatsApp, mobile phone calls, email, and so on. And people often will send me documentary evidence that way. When you get a report, such as the report last night about the hospital, you then ask yourself, how can I confirm it? This involves reaching out to more people and speaking to monitoring groups. And the picture that you get is as accurate as you can be in this conflict.
Yeah, that's very understandable. And we know, for example, government forces tonight are accused of targeting the hospital in Aleppo. Is there any confirmation that they carried out the attack?
Well, I've been speaking to eyewitnesses and to rescue workers from the White Helmets, that's Syria's main emergency response force tonight. And all indications do point to 3 separate airstrikes on the same facility. The fact that it's not shelling is almost an immediate way to rule out the rebels, which leaves you with the regime and Russia. And from the pattern of flights that people are describing, it sounds more likely than not to be the regime. If true, it would also fit a well-worn pattern. The regime often attacks locations in civilian areas, the sort of very bread and butter of daily life, be it hospitals, schools, marketplaces, and they might make life so unbearable for civilians in these areas that they have to flee, clearing the ground for the forces when they do come in to hold territory and recapture it for good.
And, Louisa, Russia is saying it had nothing to do with the attacks. Is there a way to verify that if we're talking about airstrikes, that those were not airstrikes conducted by Russian fighter jets?
Well, that's a great question. At this stage, it's not clear whether it's a mixture of regime and Russian forces or an entirely Russian strike. People do describe different types of experience when the bombs land. With the regime, the planes often fly much lower, so you hear them, you sometimes see them, and then you see the strike. But the level of technology that Russia is deploying in terms of the planes it's got in the air, often people say that 1 minute they're going about their daily lives, the next minute there's an explosion and they have no idea where it comes from. And then monitoring groups have subsequently said that they are Russian planes.
All right, journalist Louisa Loveluck in Istanbul on the story for us this evening. Louisa, thank you very much. Well, we want to go now to Washington, D.C. Hardin Lang joins me. He is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He has been an advisor on numerous UN missions, including Iraq and Kosovo. He's also been a special envoy to Haiti for the Clinton White House. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Lang. The UN tonight calling for joint U.S.-Russian intervention again in Syria. Will it happen?
So what Stefan de Mistura is calling for, the UN envoy, would be stepped-up intervention by both the United States and Russia to speak with their parties of influence inside of the conflict to try to return the levels of violence to what we have seen in, say, February and March, when the ceasefire actually reduced violence to levels that many of us were surprised to see. The real question right now is whether or not that kind of influence really exists and whether or not they're going to be willing to exercise it. My sense of it is that on the United States side, there is a willingness to try to work more with the opposition to have the ceasefire hold. But what we've seen in the last couple of days in particular is the level of violence moving in and around Aleppo, much of which is coming from the regime, is something that the Russians are going to have to carry the water for. They're going to have to exercise their influence. And it's not clear that they're prepared to do that. We've also seen on the ground, as you reported, an increase in buildup in Syrian forces in and around Aleppo. This is regime forces. So there's a sense that perhaps we're getting ready to see another level of offensive against the opposition-controlled areas in Aleppo.
So are you saying then this is an issue of influence on the warring parties and basically being able to keep them on a short leash? And if you're saying that, then it implies that on the Assad side, Russia is almost complicit or is allowing these attacks to take place.
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. And I think it's fair to say that Moscow does exert a significant degree of influence over Damascus in the way in which it conducts the wider strategy for the campaign. But at the same time, we have seen over the course of the ceasefire and even before, and then over the course of the negotiations, a bit of dispute and distance between Moscow and Damascus. And I mean, this should come as no surprise. The United States, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan had hundreds of thousands of troops deployed and were unable to sort of control the degree or the influence completely the political process over which their troops were deployed. So it wouldn't surprise me completely if the regime is sort of dictating an increase in the pace of its activities. But I think at a certain stage, they're going to have to require Moscow's concurrence.
All right, Hardin Lang, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Hardin Lang joining us from Washington with the Center for American Progress. Mr. Lang, thank you very much.